Unaware his wife was negotiating a multi-billion-dollar merger deal with his boss, he served her divorce papers in the kitchen, the office meeting that followed. He didn't just end his marriage in the kitchen, he humiliated it. On a quiet weekday morning, with no witnesses but cold countertops and an untouched cup of coffee, Daniel Carter slid a manila envelope across the kitchen island like it was an overdue utility bill. No real conversation, no real warning, just paper. He told himself this was control. He told himself this was clean. By the time the executive boardroom went silent, by the time his boss stopped looking at him as an asset, by the time the big merger meeting ended with his job already erased from every restructuring chart, Daniel still didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong. Because long before the office meeting, long before the whispers in the hallway, long before his public unraveling, he made his most careless decision at home. While his wife stood there reading every line without crying, while he mistook her silence for surrender, while he congratulated himself for being decisive, Daniel never once asked what she'd really been doing with her time. He never tracked the late nights she didn't explain, the calls taken in another room, the laptop he never saw her use in front of him, the documents she always put away before he walked in. He thought she was quiet because she was small. He thought her lack of drama meant dependence. He thought the real power in their house lived where he stood. What he didn't know, what he never bothered to suspect, was that the same woman he had just served divorce papers to in their kitchen was finalizing a multi-billion-dollar merger with the leadership team his boss answered to every morning, disclosed to the board, ring-fenced by lawyers, structured so carefully that even her own husband was walled off from the details. What followed for Daniel wasn't a screaming match. It wasn't begging. It wasn't movie-style revenge. It was an office meeting he wasn't prepared for. A room he thought he was finally important enough to sit in, a silence far more dangerous than anger. Because when the truth finally surfaced, when he saw who had actually been shaping the room he worshipped, it didn't just shock him, it ended him. Dear viewers, thanks for being here. If you're watching without subscribing, it's like watching someone's work in the background and assuming it doesn't matter. When you subscribe, you stand with everyone who was underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, yet chose strategy, patience, and proof over noise instead of shouting at the wrong people. The envelope hit the counter with a sharp slap. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch, but the sound cut through the room like a warning shot. Daniel Carter stood on the other side of the kitchen island, suit already on, tie knotted too tight. 38. A rising mid-level executive at Helix Freight and Manufacturing. He wore the same expression he used in tense meetings, chin raised just a little higher than the situation required. In his head, this was a necessary pivot. In reality, he already had one foot out the door. Evelyn, 35, watched him. She wasn't frozen. She was taking inventory. She had learned years ago how to look smaller than she was, not because she lacked presence, but because powerful people revealed more when they thought you weren't a threat. Long before she was anyone's wife, she'd sat in rooms where the loudest voice lost first. Her father, a meticulous private investor, rarely said, "I love you," but he did say, "Read the contract again." He taught her to study deals before stories, to listen longer than she spoke, and to treat every signature like a loaded weapon. When he died, she didn't inherit a company. She inherited something rarer: access. Access to a discreet web of investors, board advisors, and corporate attorneys who preferred anonymity to applause. Through them, she stepped into work that suited her too well: quiet, high-stakes advisory roles, mergers, restructurings, risk mapping. Always through vehicles and entities that weren't in her married name. Often simply as Evelyn Brooks, the name on her birth certificate and on the old NDAs. By her late 20s, she could read a term sheet faster than most executives skimmed an email. She could point to the clause that would explode a year later, then build a structure where it never did. When Daniel met her, she had already chosen to step back from public-facing positions, not because she'd failed, because she'd done the math. Visibility came with limits. Invisibility came with freedom. Daniel never asked many follow-up questions. He liked that she didn't talk specifics about clients. He accepted the NDAs she mentioned as old work. He liked feeling like the one with the obvious career, so she let him. Now, in their kitchen, Daniel watched her like she was part of the house reliable infrastructure. The person who made sure there was food, that bills got paid, that his shirts came back from the cleaners on time. What he didn't notice was how her eyes moved. The micro-pause when he said, "This doesn't have to be complicated." The way his left hand tightened when he pushed the envelope forward. How the envelope itself sat just out of her easy reach, like a dare. "Evelyn," he said, clearing his throat. "You should read it." Her wedding ring caught the light as she rested her hand on the counter. Order mattered to her not because she was rigid, but because disorder exposed people before they were ready to speak. Daniel mistook her stillness for shock. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he continued, voice careful, rehearsed. "This doesn't have to be complicated or ugly. We can do this like adults." She finally picked up the envelope. The law firm logo in the corner was one she recognized from industry gossip. Efficient, aggressive in negotiations, less impressive in subtle detail. The kind of place corporations use for quick fixes, not intricate strategy. She slid the papers out and read the way she always read something important, once for structure, once for where someone assumed she was naive. Generic clauses. Sloppy assumptions about her income. A proposed split that only made sense if she had no independent means and no access to good advice. He thought this was clean. In the background, a financial news channel muttered about corporate restructurings and minority control clauses. A graphic flashed across the screen with a headline that was technically wrong. Daniel scoffed, half listening. They don't even understand how minority control clauses really work. They're protective, not decorative, Evelyn said automatically, eyes still on the wording about assets. He blinked. "Since when do you know that stuff?" "Since always," she said quietly. He laughed it off. "You've been watching too many documentaries." She let the moment pass. There was no point correcting his memory. He'd never chosen to store those details anyway. An hour later, he left for work convinced he had handled it. That night, long after his footsteps faded down the hall and his breathing evened into sleep, Evelyn stood alone in the small room he called storage. To him, it was junk. Old boxes, out-of-season clothes, a file cabinet he never opened. To her, it was containment. She moved a stack of photo albums, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a slim, matte laptop, hers, never shared, no stickers, no brand new shine, just a practiced kind of anonymity. Inside the drawer was also a plain folder, labeled only with a date from 18 months earlier and a code name, Project Northbridge. No company logo, no flashy branding. Just a thick non-disclosure agreement and the sparse notes she allowed herself to keep at home. She powered on the laptop. The screen glowed softly in the dark as she passed through two-factor authentication and a hardware key Daniel didn't even know existed. Merger dashboard status. 92% complete. Two logos appeared side by side. On the left, the holding group that had hired her as a confidential advisor. On the right, the blue and steel emblem she saw on Daniel's work badge every morning. Helix Freight and Manufacturing. Evelyn exhaled. Not in panic, not in relief, in control. When the holding group had retained her, she had disclosed everything. Her marriage, Daniel's employer, his title, his lack of decision-making authority at the levels that mattered for this deal. The board had documented her conflict of interest statement. Her role was limited to structure, value, and risk, not to individual employment outcomes or compensation tables. She was ring-fenced away from anything that touched Daniel personally. On paper, there was no conflict. In her kitchen, he had just made it intimate. She checked the latest notes, regulatory clearances, revised valuations, board meeting dates. The final integration briefing was locked in. She closed the laptop and stood in the stillness, listening to the muffled sound of Daniel turning in his sleep down the hall. Soon, she would say very little in a room that mattered far more than this kitchen. And the room where Daniel felt safest at work would no longer have a chair with his name on it. Years before the envelope, before Project Northbridge, before Lauren, the front door slammed hard enough that the frame rattled. Daniel stormed into the living room, tie loosened, face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from fear. "I'm done," he snapped, pacing. "They're setting me up to fail. The supplier pulled out and now it's all on me. They're saying I signed off on bad terms." His briefcase hit the floor. Papers slid out, printed contracts, decks, half-scribbled notes. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it, like the sound itself was an accusation. Evelyn looked up from the couch. Not startled, not annoyed. Present. This was the version of Daniel the office rarely saw, the one before he'd learned to perform competence. She shifted to the floor beside the scattered documents, crossing her legs. "What exactly are they blaming you for?" she asked. He rubbed his forehead. "The whole contract. They say I greenlit a risk that killed the project. If this sticks, I'm done." "What did you actually approve?" she asked, reaching for the top page. "Standard stuff," he said, defensive. "Everyone signs those internal approvals." Evelyn started reading. She always did the first pass silently. Clause by clause, she watched the architecture take shape. Risk pushed downward. Accountability blurred. Language that sounded harmless unless you knew where it diverted responsibility. She saw the trap in under a minute. "You didn't fail," she said. "You were positioned to absorb blame if anything went wrong." He stared. "How do you know that?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because they'd never really laid out her world in his language. "I used to help build deals like this," she said. "This kind of wording doesn't happen by accident." They stayed on the floor until midnight, dissecting the contract. She flagged phrases that looked harmless but shifted liability. She drafted questions that forced clarity instead of emotion. She suggested emails he could send that didn't accuse anyone, but clearly documented what he'd actually approved. "Keep copies of everything," she said as she stacked the pages in order. "Emails, meeting notes, screenshots if you have to." "You worry too much," he said, trying to smile. "It's just work." To him, she was being supportive. To her, she was installing airbags. By the end of the week, Daniel still had his job. By the end of the month, people were calling him resilient under pressure. He told colleagues he'd fought for clarity. He never mentioned Evelyn. Someone did notice, though. A few months later, his mother, Margaret Carter, sat at their dining table while Daniel took a call in the bedroom. Evelyn was surrounded by neatly arranged piles of paper. "You're the reason my son stands upright," Margaret said, watching her. Evelyn looked up, startled. "I just organize things." Margaret shook her head. "No, he thinks strength is loud. You understand that it's quiet and prepared." Evelyn smiled politely, but inside she stored the observation away with everything else. Over the years, the pattern repeated. A crisis at work. Daniel came home with a stack of documents and a tight jaw. Evelyn read, translated, and turned chaos into a plan. Sometimes it was a supplier issue. Sometimes a compliance scare. Sometimes a manager trying to shift blame. Each time, she mapped who moved, which kind of risk where. She learned her husband's company like someone studying a system, not just sympathizing with a person. From Daniel's point of view, he had a wife who calmed him down and helped him think straight. From Evelyn's point of view, she could see clearly how quickly the same executives praising him would sacrifice him if a bigger deal required it. Much later, when he would sit in a bar with another woman telling him he was meant for more, he would feel newly understood. And Evelyn, quiet, watching, no longer cushioning every fall, would recognize the pattern instantly. The difference was that this time, she would not sprint ahead to catch him. She would simply step out from under where he insisted on standing. The first time Lauren Mills stepped into Daniel's space, it looked accidental. Outside the elevator on the 12th floor, she turned a corner too fast. They almost collided. Her hands shot out, fingers resting on his forearm, just long enough to steady herself and to hold his eyes. "Daniel, right?" she asked, like she already knew the answer. He nodded, thrown off more by her certainty than by the nearly dropped coffee. Lauren was 31, sharp angles and sharper timing. Her suits always looked a notch more considered than everyone else's. She worked in strategic development, 2 floors above him, close enough to executive decks to see outlines of big plans, far enough that she still had to prove she belonged. At first it was nothing. Compliments on his data slides, casual questions in cross-functional meetings. "We should grab coffee sometime," tossed over her shoulder as she left a conference room. At home, he mentioned her in passing. "Lauren from upstairs," he said one evening as he loosened his tie. "She's seriously sharp." Evelyn rinsed a mug. "Sharp people move things forward," she replied, then quieter. "They also cut." Daniel didn't notice the second part. He was already scrolling an email Lauren had just sent, praising a point he'd made in a meeting no one else had reacted to. Coffee chats turned into regular check-ins. "Where do you actually want to be in 5 years?" Lauren asked him once, notebook open, pen spinning between her fingers. "I don't know," he admitted. "Director, maybe. VP if I'm lucky. I've been doing the work, but I'm not in their rooms yet." "Exactly," she said. You're functioning above your pay grade without the title. That's their advantage, not yours. The sentence wrapped itself around his ego like a warm jacket. She dropped hints about things he hadn't heard about yet. There's something big moving, she said one afternoon, voice lower in the company cafe. Board's been meeting off-cycle. Strategy is uploading decks to restricted folders. This isn't just reforecasting. This is merger territory. Then why don't I know anything? He asked. She shrugged. Because they still see you as middle, useful, not critical. For now, dug into something restless inside him. Over the next months, their boundaries slid. Messages came later in the evening. Jokes edged personal. She remembered small things he'd said about feeling overlooked. Does your wife work? Lauren asked one night after a networking event as they lingered by the hotel bar. She does consulting, Daniel said. Old clients, private stuff. She's pretty low-key about it. So, she doesn't really get what it's like here, Lauren said, swirling her drink. The politics, the pressure. He hesitated, then nodded. Not like we do, no. Supportive, not ambitious. That was how he'd come to categorize Evelyn without realizing it. Support is nice, Lauren said. But ambition is electric. The word electric stayed with him all the way home. Evelyn felt the shift before he ever said Lauren's name again. She noticed the new cologne he didn't mention buying. The way he talked more about what I deserve and less about what I'm learning. The growing impatience when she answered his venting with structure instead of flattery. She didn't search his phone. She didn't interrogate. She did what she always did, observed. She also made a quiet adjustment of her own. She stopped volunteering strategies for his office politics. If he wanted to believe he was navigating alone now, she would let him test that belief. One evening, after too many drinks, Lauren leaned close enough that her perfume settled on his shirt. Men like you, she said, usually realize they built their lives around people who don't match their trajectory. He frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, she said smiling, you're heading somewhere bigger, and not everyone you started with can go. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The idea followed him home and sat with him at the kitchen table the next morning while Evelyn poured his coffee and reminded him, gently, about a dentist appointment he'd forgotten. He looked at her then and, for the first time, wondered if quiet might actually mean small. He never once considered that the person he was mentally downgrading had already been in rooms far bigger than any Lauren had ever shadowed. They were still in the same quiet morning, the coffee still cooling on the counter, when the moment finally turned from shock into something she could measure. The envelope hit the kitchen counter for the second time in their marriage. The first had been a mortgage approval, hopeful, heavy, the day they decided this house was theirs. This time, the envelope was thinner. The weight came from what it ended, not from what it promised. Evelyn stood barefoot on the cool tile, her coffee going lukewarm beside the cutting board. The morning light came in at an angle, touching the ring on her finger, the stainless steel sink, the pale manila of the envelope. Daniel had chosen the kitchen on purpose, not the bedroom, where history might soften him, not the living room, where emotion had room to echo. The kitchen was practical, neutral, a place where things got done and cleaned away. He placed the papers next to the knife block and squared their edges like a spreadsheet column. I've already spoken to a lawyer, he said. This doesn't have to be ugly. The lawyer had been recommended by a senior colleague, someone Lauren knew, someone he wanted to impress. Fast, efficient, known for keeping messy divorces out of the office rumor mill. Evelyn held his gaze for a beat, then lowered her eyes to the envelope again. Her chest hurt. But the hurt wasn't surprise. It was the solid, familiar ache of finally seeing something in writing that she'd felt forming for months. She didn't grab the papers. She let the silence stretch just long enough to see what he did when no one rushed to fill it. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. I just think this is better, he said, aiming for reasonable. We've grown in different directions. You're comfortable. I'm aiming higher. My life is changing. I need a partner who fits that. The word comfortable landed harder than he meant it to. You've been distant for months, he added quickly, as if building a case. You don't come to events anymore. You don't ask about the big moves happening at work. I need someone who wants that world with me. You stopped asking for my help when you found someone who flattered you, she thought. But she didn't say it. Instead, she picked up the envelope and slid the petition out. She read it the way she read every structure that could reshape a life. Slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. Assets, income assumptions, proposed timelines. Her consultancy was listed in a single line, described as minimal irregular income. Her father's estate appeared as vague, family background, not as the properly documented, ring-fenced investment portfolio it actually was. The document was built on a premise that she had always been a supporting character in Daniel's story, not someone with her own. He misread her silence as emotional shock. "I know this is sudden," he went on, "but we can make this smooth. No one at work even has to know the details." She lifted her eyes. "Who told you this was a good idea?" she asked calmly. "And that I'd just sign?" He faltered for a fraction of a second, long enough for her to see Lauren's shadow move across his face. "It's my decision," he said finally. "I don't need anyone's permission." Evelyn turned to the last page and read every line. No mention of any serious spousal support, because he'd framed her as someone who could get a job if she wanted. No acknowledgement of the unpaid work she'd done that had directly saved his career more than once. She set the papers flat on the counter, aligning them with the edge. "You're not going to say anything?" he demanded. "After everything? I heard you," she replied. "That's it?" Her voice stayed steady. "This is a legal document, Daniel, not a conversation. You've already had the conversation with whoever helped you write this." His jaw clenched. "I want this clean," he repeated, as if the word itself were a shield. "Then send me your lawyer's details," she said. "And copies of anything he used to make assumptions about me. I'll respond through counsel." "Why do you need to make it so formal?" he asked, irritation edging in. "Because it is formal," she said. "You made it formal when you turned our marriage into something you served with a logo in the corner." For the first time since he placed the envelope down, he seemed unsure. He grabbed his keys. "I'll email you his contact," he said, retreating toward the door. "I have a 9:30. "Daniel," she said. He stopped, hand on the handle. "You should be careful who you let advise you," she added. "Not everyone standing next to you is invested in what happens to you 3 steps after this." He scoffed. "You don't understand my world anymore." The door closed a little harder than necessary. Evelyn stayed where she was, listening to the quiet that followed. Then she turned the envelope over and traced the law firm's logo with her thumb, mentally cataloging the small tells, the rushed drafting, the missing nuance. He had walked into a process she understood far better than he did. He just didn't know it. For the first time that morning, her expression changed. It wasn't relief. It wasn't vindictive. It was resolve. The kitchen was no longer just the place where decisions arrived. It was where she would decide, very carefully, how everything moved next. The echo of the slammed door faded. The house went still. Evelyn didn't move for a long moment. She stood with her hands on either side of the divorce papers, wedding ring cool against her skin. Then quietly she slid the ring off. A pale band remained on her finger. A faint circle of years lived in good faith. She placed the ring beside the envelope, lining it up with the edge of the paper. The silence around her no longer felt like something being done to her. It felt like available space. She picked up her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't used in months, but had never deleted. Marcus Levin. A calm voice answered after the second ring. "It's Evelyn," she said. He filed. Marcus didn't ask who he was. He knew. He'd met Daniel once at a charity event years ago, when Evelyn had introduced him as an old colleague of my father's. He'd watched enough corporate divorces, personal and professional, to read the rest. "Are you safe?" he asked first. "Yes," she said. "I'm fine. I'm informed." A brief pause, then his tone shifted into the professional lane they both understood. "I've seen the petition," he said. "His counsel filed it electronically this morning. It's exactly what I'd expect from that firm, confident in tone, thin in substance. We can dismantle it in a week if you want to go aggressive." "I don't," she said. "I want it accurate, clean, no spectacle. I'm not interested in punishing him. Then we'll correct the assumptions about your income, protect your share of the house and the estate, and keep it out of any venue that invites attention," Marcus replied. "We'll treat it like any other uneven deal." "Good," she said. He hesitated. "And Northbridge?" There it was, the other axis of her life. "The board wants signatures inside 48 hours, he continued. "Regulators are cleared. The structure is locked unless someone has a serious last-minute objection." "We proceed as planned," she said. "Ring fencing stays intact." I don't want any suggestion that my divorce influenced the deal terms. It doesn't, he said. His role is mid-tier. You've been excluded from all individual employment decisions. That's in writing. She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. I want one update, she added. I'm listening, Marcus said. For the final integration briefing, she said, I want an operations representative at Daniel's level in the room as an observer. Someone who sits where the impact is felt, not just in the C-suite. That's already in the plan, Marcus said. We suggested one to Richard's office. HR is proposing your husband, given his current title. We flagged the relationship in the file and noted you're recused from any decision about his employment. The board accepted the arrangement. So he'll be invited, she said. Yes, Marcus replied. To listen, not to negotiate. Good, she said quietly. He deserves to hear how the company he trusted actually works, from the people who run it. And in the divorce? Marcus asked. Do you want me to send his counsel an early warning about how the merger might affect his income? It changes the numbers. Evelyn looked at the petition again, at the way he'd framed her as dependent, at the timing he'd chosen, clearly believing he was stepping into a bigger version of himself. No, she said. We'll disclose what's required, but we won't pre-argue his career for him. That part is his responsibility. They confirmed next steps. He'd send her a clean summary of the petition. She'd sign a limited power of attorney for filings. They'd finalize a response after the board meeting, not before. When she hung up, the house no longer felt like a stage where things happened to her. It felt like a place where she was back in control of the script. She walked down the hall to the small storage room, shut the door, and opened the locked drawer again. The laptop woke to her touch. Login approved Project Northbridge merger progress. 92% complete next milestone. Executive board and integration, briefing 2 days. She opened the attendee overview Marcus had mentioned. Board members, senior executives, external counsel, strategic development. At the bottom, operations representative, observer. Daniel Carter, regional lead conflict disclosure. Spouse, Evelyn Brooks, engaged as external advisor. Ring fencing, confirmed. Evelyn stared at his name for a moment. Once, she would have quietly worked to protect his position, maybe pushed for a carve-out, an exception, a transitional role. She knew how to do that. It would have been easy, structurally. Now she closed the document without changing a word. His division was bloated. The model worked better without that layer. That was objective reality, not personal judgment. He had chosen to turn their marriage into an item on a legal docket. She was choosing to stop bending the rest of her life around his blind spots. She powered down the laptop, returned it to the drawer, and locked it. Back in the kitchen, she slid the divorce papers into a folder of her own, not to hide them, but to file them in the right category. One process among many, not the center of her existence. Somewhere across town, Daniel sat in a bar, rehearsing the story he'd tell. How he was finally taking charge, how his life was about to level up, how a big move at work might finally prove everyone had underestimated him. He thought this was the day he took control. Evelyn rinsed her cold coffee down the sink, washed the mug, and set it upside down to dry. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't standing behind him, patching the cracks in his story. She was standing on her own side of the table, ready for a boardroom he didn't even know she had built. Daniel Carter laughed as the revolving doors of Helix Freight and Manufacturing spun him out onto the street. The sound startled even him too loud, too sharp for the tightness in his chest, but it made a good story in his head. A man finally shaking off the weight of a marriage that didn't fit anymore. Divorce papers served, hard part done, trajectory fixed. That was the story he chose. He checked his reflection in the lobby glass, a mid-level operations lead in a well-cut suit, 38, ambitious, with just enough tired around the eyes to signal he'd put in the years. He straightened his tie and turned toward the bar across the street. Lauren Mills was already inside. She sat in a booth near the back, where the noise from the TVs turned into a comfortable hum. Her phone lay face down beside her drink, a small signal he'd learned to interpret as, "You have my attention for now." When he slid into the seat opposite, she studied his face before speaking. "So," she said, raising her glass slightly. "You did it?" "Yeah," he exhaled, forcing a smile. "I served her this morning." "How'd she take it?" Lauren asked. "Casual, but watching closely." "Better than I expected," he said. Too well, actually. No crying, no yelling. She just read the papers. He tried to make it sound like a criticism, but underneath there was something like unease. Lauren's mouth twitched. People freeze when they lose the thing that made them feel secure, she said. She'll probably fall apart later. He nodded, letting himself accept that version. It was cleaner than the truth that he had no idea what she would do. She changed gears smoothly. Anyway, she said, you picked an interesting week for major life changes. Things are moving up there. She tilted her head toward the floors above his. Fast, Daniel frowned. Fast how? There's a session on the top floor in 2 days, she said. Not the usual quarterly check-in. Executive level, restricted decks, off-cycle board calls. It smells like a merger. The word sent a jolt through him. Are you sure? He asked. Rumors start every time someone from the parent group flies in. I don't deal in rumors, Lauren said. I see calendars. I see who's booked in which rooms, which folders get restricted, which decks have Northbridge in the file name and disappear into encrypted channels. He blinked. Northbridge? She smirked. Internal code name. You didn't hear it from me. He tried to hide the sting. I haven't heard a thing, he admitted. Apparently my level doesn't warrant that kind of visibility. For the moment, she said. He took a drink, the burn flattening some of his frustration. You're the one they rely on when logistics go sideways, Lauren continued. I see your name all over project email chains. You're functioning like senior staff without the senior invite list. That's their advantage, not yours. Her words wrapped around the bruised part of his ego, warm and validating. So why tell me? He asked. You don't get points for giving me a heads up. I like working with people who could keep up in bigger rooms, she said. If this merger is what I think it is, there are going to be new chairs at new tables. Someone should make sure your name isn't forgotten. Her phone lit up for a second, then dimmed. Reflexively, she flipped it over, glanced once, then put it face down again. Her posture shifted, more alert, more focused. Speaking of, she said, finishing her drink, I need to prep for tomorrow. Strategies knee-deep in models and what-ifs. Am I going to be told what's going on at some point? He asked, half joking, half serious. If I can help it, she said, touching his shoulder lightly as she slid out of the booth. You won't be the last to know. She kissed his cheek quickly soft, practiced, and was gone before he could respond. For a moment, he sat there feeling buoyant. Divorce in motion, a possibly huge merger on the horizon. A woman in strategy who thought he was being underused. It all felt like momentum. By the time he got home, the bar's warmth had faded. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too neat, but he told himself that was temporary. He dropped onto the couch, opened his work email, and checked his calendar. Nothing. No Project Northbridge. No executive session confidential. Just regular status meetings and a reminder about a performance check-in. He refreshed. Nothing. Somewhere in a different office a few blocks away, his name was already attached to an attendee line as operations representative observer, flagged with a conflict disclosure Evelyn had filed months before. He assumed Lauren would have to nudge someone to get him into that room. He never considered that the person who had made sure his role would be represented there without altering a single fair process was the same woman he'd told that morning she no longer fit the life he was moving into. 2 blocks from Helix's main building, high above the street, the conference room in the holding group's office was quiet enough to make every page turn sound deliberate. Evelyn sat at the rectangular table, a legal pad in front of her, pen uncapped but idle. Across from her, Marcus Levin set a printout on the table and slid it toward her. That, he said, is the petition Daniel's lawyer filed this morning. I pulled it from the court docket. Evelyn glanced at the header, the same firm logo she'd seen on the envelope at her kitchen counter, then scanned the first page. It's as we expected, Marcus went on. Overconfident in tone, underdeveloped in detail. Income assumptions about you are wrong by a wide margin. Property division is skewed. Nothing we can't fix. I don't want a spectacle, Evelyn said. No aggressive filings, no threats, just corrections. Marcus nodded. We'll restate your income accurately, protect your share of the house, and clarify the treatment of your father's estate. No press, no courtroom theatrics. I'll draft a clean, firm response and send it for your review after the board meeting. Naomi Reed, senior advisor for the holding group, slid her tablet into the space between them. Speaking of the board meeting, she said, tapping the screen. This is where we are on Project Northbridge. A familiar dashboard lit up timelines, charts, ownership structures. Regulatory approvals are cleared, Naomi said. All conditions precedent are satisfied. The only remaining step is execution at Helix's side and confirmation of the integration plan. She swiped to a page outlining the post-merger organization. The new operations structure removes the mid-level regional management tier, she said. You can see here, she zoomed. This layer has been absorbing responsibility without having real strategic authority. We've preserved frontline supervision and senior oversight. The middle tier is being collapsed. Evelyn's eyes took in the boxes and lines. One of those boxes was where Daniel currently sat. Is the cut justified beyond short-term cost savings? She asked. Naomi nodded. Yes. The models run cleaner and more flexible without that tier. And we're not zeroing out the people without support. Severance is above median. There's a redeployment matrix for high-skill roles. It's firm, but it's not reckless. Marcus folded his hands. HR at Helix has the list of affected positions, he said. Your husband's role is on it. Our conflict file notes that you've been recused from any decisions touching individual employees, including him. Good, Evelyn said quietly. Keep that record tight. I don't want anything blurring that line. Naomi slid to the attendee list for the final briefing at Helix headquarters. There's your side, she said, indicating the holding group's column. And here, she pointed to the other column, are Helix's attendees, board, executives, strategy, HR, operations representative, observer level, Daniel Carter. HR proposed him last month. Richard approved. Evelyn saw his name, exactly where she'd seen it on her laptop the night before. Conflict disclosure attached, Naomi added. We confirmed your ring fencing. The board is comfortable with him in the room as an observer. He won't be speaking into structural decisions. So he'll hear the plan at the same time as everyone else on that floor, Evelyn said. Yes, Marcus replied. In real time. No surprises after the fact beyond the ones he's already chosen for himself. Evelyn sat back. Once, she might have argued for a softer landing just for him. An extra conversation, a private warning. Now, she was careful. The structure works? She asked again. If I weren't married to him, would I still recommend this design? Yes, Naomi said. We'd likely be where we are now, with or without Daniel Carter. Then we don't distort it, Evelyn said. We keep it fair. We keep it documented, and we let Helix handle its people according to the plan they agreed to. Marcus made a note. We'll finalize the integration briefing materials today, Naomi said. Board meeting tomorrow, 10 a.m., at Helix HQ. Execution copies will be ready. Once signed, the transaction is effectively irreversible without significant damage. Evelyn nodded. File our divorce response after that, she told Marcus. I don't want anyone suggesting we timed anything around his employment status. We won't, he said. Your timelines were set months before he made his move. The paper trail shows that. They stood. Naomi hesitated as they walked toward the elevator. Are you sure you don't want something more formal out of this? She asked. A public-facing title, maybe. Once Helix sees how smoothly this goes, they'll ask who you are. They already know who I am where it matters, Evelyn said. If a title gives me more leverage on the next deal, I'll take it. I don't need my face in their press release. Naomi smiled faintly. You are the only person I know who can move a multi-billion-dollar deal and still worry about being too visible. Visible people make easy targets, Evelyn replied. The elevator doors opened. In less than 24 hours, she would step into a boardroom Daniel had only ever seen from the outside. He'd walk into that same room convinced someone new had finally pulled him in. He still didn't realize the structure he wanted so badly to belong to was one she had been quietly shaping long before he decided she no longer fit his idea of ambition. Daniel stared at his phone all morning, as if looking at the screen hard enough would make the notification appear. At 9:12 a.m., it did. New event. Project Northbridge Executive Session, confidential location. Helix HQ, 18th floor boardroom attendees. Board, CEO, CFO, Strategic Development, HR. Near the bottom, Daniel Carter, Operations Observer. His heart kicked. A second message followed almost immediately, an internal note from his director. Daniel, you've been added as Operations Representative Observer for today's Northbridge briefing. Listen, take notes, and keep this confidential until comms go out. M. He read it twice, then opened his messages. Lauren had texted late the previous night, after he'd complained he was being kept in the dark. You're right. It's ridiculous you aren't looped in. I'll nudge where I can. Watch your inbox tomorrow. He looked from her message to the invite and decided the cause and effect was obvious. Of course she'd pushed someone. Of course she'd made this happen. That was the kind of ally he'd been needing. He adjusted his tie in the restroom mirror, straightened his shoulders, and made his way up to the top floor, first by elevator, then through a set of glass doors he'd only ever passed as part of a larger crowd. The 18th floor boardroom felt like another company entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows, heavy table, art that never made it to the lower levels. People here didn't carry laptops the way they did on his floor. They carried decisions. He slipped into a chair along the wall. In the row of observers, mid-tier managers, a couple of specialists from strategy, someone from legal. Lauren sat at the table itself, a few seats down from the CFO, notebook open, expression focused. She looked back just long enough to give him a small, quick smile, then turned toward the head of the table as if she'd been there all along. Good morning, said Richard Hale, Helix's CEO, from his seat at the end of the table. The room quieted almost instantly. We'll begin as soon as our external lead advisor arrives. External. Daniel had assumed this would be mostly Richard and the CFO talking through slides. Maybe someone from the parent company dialed in. The door opened. For a second, Daniel's brain refused to make sense of what his eyes saw. Evelyn walked in, not in jeans and a soft sweater, not barefoot in their kitchen, but in a dark, tailored suit he didn't recognize, hair pulled back cleanly, a slim folio in her hand. A visitor badge clipped at her waist read, E. Brooks, Strategic Advisor, External, Brooks, her maiden name. She didn't look at him. Richard stood enough to acknowledge her. Thank you for joining us, Miss Brooks, he said, and for your work getting us to this stage. Of course, Evelyn replied, taking the seat beside him, with the familiarity of someone who'd been in that room many times before. Her voice was the same one that had asked him if he wanted more coffee that morning he'd decided to end their marriage. The context was completely different. Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. Lauren's pen hovered over her notebook. She went perfectly still. Richard gestured toward Evelyn. If you'll walk us through the final structure, he said. Evelyn opened her folio. The purpose of today's session, she began, is to confirm execution of the Northbridge transaction and review the integration structure on Helix's side, with a focus on operations, risk, and long-term positioning. Her tone was measured, calm. This was not a woman improvising. This was someone presenting architecture she had helped design. She moved through key points with ease. Regulatory approvals, greenlit, purchase price and consideration mix, aligned with prior board resolutions. Post-merger structure, leaner, clearer reporting lines, risk distribution, balance between Helix and the holding group. Board members interrupted with questions. Some of them were the type of questions that could expose a weak advisor. She answered with page numbers, references to prior memos, and alternative scenarios they'd already stress-tested. No one in the room looked surprised to see her doing this, except him. On the far wall, a slide showed Helix's current operational hierarchy. Then the post-merger version. Boxes disappeared in the middle. Lines redrew. Evelyn tapped the screen. As discussed in previous sessions, she said, the mid-level regional operations tier is being removed. Responsibilities are redistributed upward to strategic leads and downward to frontline supervisors. This reduces decision drag and clarifies accountability. Daniel's eyes traced the before and after diagrams. His box wasn't there in the after. Lauren shifted, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Richard picked up from there. Certain positions in operations will not map forward, he said. HR will manage individual conversations and transitions. Today is about structure and strategic fit. To most people in that room, positions meant anonymous roles. To Daniel, it was personal. He stared at Evelyn. The woman he'd served papers to in their kitchen was now calmly explaining why the layer he sat in no longer belonged in the company's future. And the worst part was that no one else seemed to think this was strange. The room's energy changed when the final set of documents was placed at the center of the table. It wasn't dramatic, just an almost physical awareness that everything up to this point had been preamble. Richard rested a hand on the folder. "If there are no further questions on structure or risk," he said, "we'll proceed to execution." A board member cleared her throat. "Just one," she said. "Are we comfortable we've handled the people side responsibly, particularly in operations?" Evelyn answered before Richard could. "The redundancy is structural, not personal," she said. "We've benchmarked severance above industry median. HR has a redeployment matrix for roles with transferable skills. We've been explicit in all internal documentation that this is about eliminating a dysfunctional layer, not punishing individuals." She flipped to a back page and tapped it lightly. "Mid-level regional operations was absorbing accountability without clear authority," she added. "That's bad design. This corrects it." Daniel felt the words land in his chest. "That's my layer." He felt his chair scrape against the floor before he realized he'd stood up. "Excuse me," he said. Every head turned. "This redundant layer you're talking about," he said, gesturing toward the slide. "That's me. That's my team. I've led operations across 3 regional crises in the last 5 years. You're just deleting us from a chart?" A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Observers along the wall stared at the table, suddenly fascinated by their notes. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, voice even, "this session is about strategic structure. Individual employment conversations will take place with human resources." Daniel ignored him. He looked at Evelyn. "You knew," he said. "While I was coming home exhausted, telling you about backlog and route failures, you were working on this. While I was serving you papers, you already knew my role was on the chopping block." Evelyn met his eyes for the first time since entering the room. "I disclosed our relationship when I was engaged," she said. "I've been recused from decisions about individual outcomes. I did not put your name on any list. I worked on the structure, not on you." "That's convenient," he snapped. "You're the one with the pen in your hand." Her gaze didn't waver. "No," she said quietly. "I'm the one who made sure this structure was fair, not painless. Fair. With or without you in that box, this is the model Helix needed. Your role didn't vanish because you were you," she added. "It vanished because the layer itself was bad design." He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I should have been involved," he said. "I know this operation better than anyone here. I've been doing the work for years. I find out now, in a room where I don't even have a vote, you were never part of this negotiation." She replied not cruelly, but plainly. "Not because you aren't capable in your lane, but because this table isn't about middle management. It's about ownership and direction. That's the level this conversation sits at." The sentence landed with more weight than any insult would have. Richard cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said, using his first name now, "I understand this feels personal, but this isn't the venue. HR will meet with you after this session. You'll be treated fairly. Please, take your seat." Daniel looked around the room. No one looked back directly. Not Lauren, who was now studying her notebook like it could shield her from being associated with him. Not his director, who stared straight ahead. For the first time, Daniel felt how very small his chair at the edge of the room really was. He sat down. Richard opened the folder. "Helix Freight and Manufacturing. Northbridge Transaction Execution Copy," he read. He signed on the designated line, then slid the folder to the next board member. One by one, pens scratched across paper. When the folder reached Evelyn, she picked up her pen. Her hand was steady. She signed, Evelyn Brooks, the name he hadn't heard in years, the name on all the NDAs he'd never asked about. The line she signed on made the merger binding, the new structure real, and his redundancy more than a rumor in a hallway. When the last signature was in place, Richard closed the folder with a soft thud. "It's done," he said. He turned to Evelyn. "On behalf of the board, thank you," he added. "Your work on Northbridge has been exemplary. We look forward to continuing the relationship on integration." "Thank you," she said. Chairs slid back. Side conversations started. People filed out, already talking about communication plans, press statements, and integration teams. Lauren gathered her notebook quickly. She didn't touch his arm. She didn't say, "I'll fix this." She didn't even meet his eyes. She slipped out with a small nod to someone from strategy and was gone. Richard paused by Daniel's chair. HR will reach out within the hour, he said. You'll be offered a competitive severance and support. Take what you've built here and use it well. This is about where the company needed to go, not about you as a person. Then he walked away. The boardroom emptied. Daniel stayed seated. He stared at the space Evelyn's chair had occupied, the neat folder that was now tucked under the arm of someone from legal. The divorce papers in his kitchen were just one kind of signature. This was another. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he wasn't being cut out in a single, dramatic moment. He'd been moving toward this for a long time, through every contract he never bothered to understand, every structure he assumed someone else would explain, every time he'd preferred validation over truth, and the person who had understood how all of it actually worked was the same one he decided he'd outgrown. Weeks later, the knock on the apartment door was short and impersonal. Daniel paused halfway to the kettle. The one bedroom still smelled like fresh paint and cardboard. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. Another knock. He opened the door. A courier stood there with a tablet and a thin envelope. Signature, please, Daniel signed. The courier handed him the envelope and left without small talk. He closed the door and looked at the return address. Family court, case number he recognized. He opened it. Final decree of divorce. No drama. No embossed flair. Just paper and stamps, documenting in precise legal language what had already been true in practice. He dropped it on the coffee table and sat down. His phone buzzed beside him, screen lighting up with a calendar reminder from days earlier. Transition meeting human resources. He'd already had it. Neutral conference room. HR representative. A manager from 2 levels up sitting stiffly, reading from a script. We appreciate your contributions, Daniel, they'd said. Under the Northbridge integration, your position is being made redundant. This isn't about your performance. It's about the new structure. He'd nodded like it was happening to someone else. They'd outlined his options. Severance package, outplacement services, a list of roles in other regions he could apply for, none at his previous level. On the way back to his floor, security met him outside the glass doors, not hostile, just present, holding a cardboard box. Company policy, his manager had murmured. We'll give you time to pack personal items. Your system access will end when you leave the floor. He remembered the quiet humiliation of dropping framed photos, a mug, and a plant into the box while people pretended not to watch. He'd ridden the elevator down for the last time, as an employee, badge already deactivated. His phone had buzzed then too. From Lauren, I heard. I'm sorry. Things move faster than I thought. It's complicated. He hadn't replied. Now, in the cramped living room, the divorce decree sat beside his phone, the personal and professional endings lying a few inches apart. Same year, same merger, same blind spots. Days later, he saw Evelyn again. Not at their house legally hers now. Not at Helix, his badge no longer opened those doors. In a neutral office downtown, in a conference room Marcus had chosen precisely because it was boring. Marcus ran through the final points in 15 minutes. Property transfers are complete, he said. Accounts updated. The decree is entered. Today is just to confirm signatures and close the loop on documentation. He looked from one to the other. You're both legally clear of each other now, he said. Whatever you say in this room is personal, not procedural. He packed his briefcase and stepped out, giving them a privacy he didn't often see in his usual work. Evelyn stood by the window, looking down at the city. When she turned, Daniel saw the familiar and unfamiliar at once. Same face, different posture. Evelyn, he said. She waited. On the ride over, he'd rehearsed speeches, apologies, accusations, cheap attempts at humor. None of them survived contact with the actual moment. I didn't know who you were, he said finally. Not really. I thought you were just quiet, just supportive, just there. The word just tasted wrong now. I was wrong, he said. She nodded once. I know. I lost the job, he added, as if she might not have heard. I know, she said again. HR had to confirm your status as part of the conflict file. He winced. Did you do this to me? It was a childish question, but an honest one. No, she said. Northbridge was moving long before you served those papers. The structure would have looked the same whether you were in operations or not. I didn't design this around you. She held his gaze. I just refused to bend it to save you, she finished. That's the difference. He swallowed. That boardroom, he said. You walking in like that. Everyone acting like you belong there, that you'd always belong there. How long have you been doing this? Longer than we've been married, she replied. You liked that I didn't drag work home. You never really asked what consulting meant beyond that. He thought of every night he dropped contracts in front of her and let her untangle the mess, then walked into work acting like the clarity had come from nowhere. I did know who you were, she added quietly. I knew your strengths, your blind spots, the way you loved validation more than information when you were scared. I chose to love you anyway, for a long time. The difference between I didn't know and I did know hung heavy between them. No one was here to referee, no court reporter, no HR rep. Just two people standing in the aftermath of choices they'd both made. Take care of yourself, Daniel, she said, gathering her folder. There was no anger in it, no invitation either. She walked past him and left the room. The door clicked shut, soft but final. For the first time since this started, he understood there was no one left to translate consequences into softer versions for him. That night, Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen of the house that was now legally hers. The counter was clear. No envelope, no ring, no unsigned papers waiting. The room felt smaller without someone else's expectations in it, and somehow more honest. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A new email preview slid across the screen. Subject: Appointment confirmed. Strategic Integration Advisor effective. Immediately, the holding group had given her a formal title for work she'd already been doing in the shadows, overseeing integration across a portfolio of companies like Helix. Mostly behind closed doors, mostly under her maiden name. She opened the email, read the brief details, and set the phone down. No celebratory dance. No dramatic monologue, just a quiet recognition that nothing about this position depended on anyone underestimating her. She turned off the kitchen light. As she walked down the hallway, she remembered Margaret's words years ago. You're the reason my son stands upright. Maybe that had been true then. Now she understood something else. It doesn't matter how long you hold someone upright if they keep insisting the ground beneath them doesn't matter. She sat on the edge of her bed, the house silent around her, an integration schedule and a new life waiting on tomorrow's calendar. Some people think power is loud. They think it's the person doing all the talking in the room. But the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate the quiet person who loved you, who learned exactly how that room works, and who finally stepped out of the job of protecting you from it. The screen fades to black. And if you're still watching, the storyteller's voice returns. Don't forget, watching someone's work in the background and assuming it doesn't matter is exactly how people like Daniel lose everything. Like, share, and comment the lesson that hit you the hardest. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and I'll see you in my next video. Unaware his wife just signed a $1 billion oil deal, he refused to pay hospital bills for her and their baby. What happened next will shock you. He didn't just abandon her once. He abandoned her twice, first in a hospital room, and later in a courtroom that would write the end of his life as he knew it. By the time the courtroom went silent, by the time the judge stripped Mark Carter of custody, approved financial penalties, and referred his behavior for criminal investigation, Mark still didn't fully grasp what he'd done. Because long before the court, long before the divorce papers, long before his public collapse, he made his cruelest decision while his wife was lying in a hospital bed. While Evelyn lay exhausted, stitched, and barely conscious after childbirth, while their newborn son cried under warm lights in the nursery, Mark stood at a window, glanced at an email from the hospital billing system, and told the administrator and social worker 2 words that would be documented, time-stamped, and played back in court. Then don't. Don't sign the authorization. Don't take responsibility. Don't pay. He refused to approve the bill. He refused to sign as guarantor. He refused to sign, even when told the baby might not be discharged without a clear way to pay. Hospital policy meant emergency care continued, of course. Doctors and nurses still did their jobs. But those 2 words triggered something else. Reports, notes, incident forms, and a quiet call to a hospital social worker who started a file with his name on it. What Mark didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that just hours earlier, the woman he dismissed as not working anymore had quietly signed a $1 billion offshore oil acquisition in her own name. protected by layers of corporate entities, lawyers, escrow, and confidentiality agreements. He thought she was dependent. He thought silence meant weakness. He thought cruelty would cost him nothing. While he joked with another woman in the hallway, while he snapped at Evelyn for embarrassing him, by reaching for her phone, his wife was learning something far more dangerous than anger. She was learning how exposed he really was. What followed wasn't screaming, wasn't chaos, wasn't a dramatic confrontation in the hospital. It was paperwork, audio recordings, hospital notes, time-stamped emails, court dates. And one by one, everything Mark believed made him powerful. His marriage, his image, his control collapsed in public. Because the woman he humiliated at her weakest moment didn't fight back the way he expected. She waited. She documented. She moved when the law, not emotion, was on her side. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just shock him, it erased him. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like letting her silence be mistaken for weakness again. When you subscribe, you stand with every woman who was underestimated, every child protected by courage, and every quiet mind that chose strategy over despair. Please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The room was silent in a way that felt heavy, almost dangerous. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of power settling into place. Evelyn Carter, 32 years old and visibly pregnant, sat at the center of a long glass table inside a private conference room high above the city skyline. The walls were transparent, but the world outside felt distant, blurred, unimportant. Inside this room, only ink mattered, only timing, only truths that hadn't yet reached the headlines. In front of her lay a stack of documents thick enough to shift entire portfolios. At the top, Final Acquisition Agreement Offshore Energy Holdings. Valuation, $1 billion. Evelyn picked up the pen. Her hand did not tremble. Across from her sat Mr. Halvorsen, late 50s, silver-haired, chairman of one of the most influential oil consortiums in the industry. He had built empires, watched men crumble, and learned to recognize real authority even when it arrived in a plain blazer and low heels. To his left and right sat two senior board attorneys, sharp-eyed, disciplined, paid to spot trouble before it matured into disaster. Near the wall stood a corporate secretary, already preparing to notarize history. No one smiled. No champagne. No press. This wasn't a celebration. It was a transfer of leverage. Evelyn signed the final page. The pen lifted. Ink dried. $1 billion moved into a structure she controlled without applause. Her phone, screen down beside the folder, buzzed once. She briefly turned it over. A missed call from Mark, and a text. Doctor said you should be on the couch, not in a meeting. Are you still resting? The wallpaper behind the notification was an old photo, Mark's arm around her waist, both of them smiling in a cramped apartment years ago when promises still felt permanent. Back then, Mark was an ambitious 36-year-old with more ideas than money. He had always liked the word provider. He liked it even more once Evelyn started saying she was taking a step back from work and stopped putting her name on anything public. He never asked what she did with her days after that. He assumed. Mr. Halvorsen cleared his throat, his voice low but respectful. You understand, he said, that if your name were public on this, you'd make every finance headline in 48 hours. Evelyn closed the folder gently, as if sealing something alive inside it. Headlines make noise, she replied. I prefer structure. The chairman studied her for a long second. Men begged to be associated with a deal like this. She had insisted on anonymity, shell companies, escrow, NDAs. What no one in the room said aloud, but all of them understood, was that Evelyn Carter did not just negotiate deals. She designed systems. Years earlier, she'd been a junior analyst at a mid-sized energy firm, sitting quietly at the far end of tables like this one, often the youngest, usually the only woman, ignored until something went wrong. She watched senior executives reuse her projections without credit. She listened to her ideas, repeated louder by someone else. That's when she learned. Visibility wasn't the same as power. Power works best when nobody realizes where it's coming from. That lesson came from her father. He'd owned a modest but profitable energy logistics company, nothing flashy, but ruthlessly organized. Before he died, he left her more than shares. He left her a sentence she heard in her head every time she hesitated. If they don't know what you're worth, they can't take it from you. After his death, She quietly folded his company into larger structures, reinvested carefully, and never tied her net worth to her personal name. What she controlled sat in holding companies. What she just signed today sat in escrow, locked until regulatory filings cleared. She could not touch the money yet. She did not need to. Mr. Halvorsen slid a final sheet across the table. Our legal team files with regulators today. Until confirmation, confidentiality is absolute. Evelyn nodded. I understand. The secretary stepped forward to notarize. The attorneys stacked their copies. The meeting ended the way it began, without noise. Evelyn stood. As she did, a faint tightening rolled across her lower abdomen. Not sharp, just enough to make her press her palm briefly against the edge of the table. First baby? The secretary asked quietly, noticing the gesture. Evelyn gave a small smile. Yes. Keep your phone on, the woman said. Babies and deals like to compete for attention. Evelyn's phone buzzed again as if on cue. Another message from Mark. Call me when you wake up. I'm grabbing coffee before a meeting. He truly believed she was at home, resting. She had let him believe that for months. It made his ego calmer, his shoulders straighter. She had thought it cost her nothing. She slid the phone into her bag without replying. Not because she was hiding, but because somewhere beneath her ribs, a feeling stirred that timing was about to matter more than any explanation. She walked toward the elevator, heels clicking against polished stone. In the mirrored doors, her reflection appeared not as a wife, not as a supportive partner, but as a woman standing alone with quiet authority. Behind her, $1 billion contract lay sealed in a folder. Ahead of her, the first real contraction tightened around her middle. And somewhere across town, Mark Carter was already behaving like a man who assumed he still controlled everything, never realizing how expensive his ignorance was about to become. The pain hit harder this time. A sharp wave tore through Evelyn's body, stealing her breath and forcing her fingers to claw into the thin hospital sheets. She inhaled through clenched teeth, exhaled slowly, doing exactly what the midwife had told her hours earlier. This one's stronger, she whispered. It had been a long day. Morning, billion-dollar signatures. Afternoon, tightening cramps that refused to calm down. Evening, her obstetrician, unimpressed with her "I'm fine," ordering her straight to the hospital. Mark had driven, complaining about traffic the entire way. Now, in a bright labor and delivery room, Mark was pacing, not beside her bed, near the door. He was 36, fit, in an expensive shirt that still smelled faintly of cologne. His phone was pressed to his ear like it was the most important thing in the room. Yeah, I know, he muttered, turning slightly toward the window. I told you, Lena. I'll call you later. The name landed in the air like a dropped glass. Too casual, too familiar. Evelyn heard it. She didn't turn her head. She didn't ask, "Who's Lena?" She focused on her breathing and stared at the ceiling, letting the contraction crest and fade. Mark lowered his voice. I'm at the hospital. No, not for me. The baby. Look, this isn't the time to talk numbers. A beat of silence while Lena answered. Mark's jaw tightened. I'll handle it, he snapped. Just don't do anything until we talk. He ended the call and slid the phone into his pocket, running a hand through his hair. His eyes flicked to Evelyn, then away, like looking too long might obligate him to something he wasn't ready to give. Another contraction rolled in. Evelyn closed her eyes. Memories surfaced like photographs. Mark in their first apartment, excited and terrified about a small startup loan, her quietly moving money from her own investments into his business account, telling him it was from a bonus. Him joking one night, half serious, I don't want my wife out earning me. I need to feel like the provider. She had smiled then, tracing circles on his wrist. Then I'll make sure you never feel small. Back then, it had sounded romantic. Later, it became a habit, turning down a visible promotion, downplaying what she actually understood about the industry, packaging every suggestion as a question so he wouldn't feel threatened. She thought she was protecting the marriage. In reality, she was building a cage for herself. A knock at the door pulled her back. A nurse in her 40s stepped in, badge reading Nurse Patel, expression warm but focused. She checked the monitor, adjusted an IV, and smiled briefly at Evelyn. You're progressing, she said. We'll likely admit you fully to labor and delivery now. She turned to Mark, professional tone clicking in. Sir, we'll need to confirm your insurance information and get your authorization for admission and postnatal care. We've sent an estimate to your phone and email. We can also discuss payment plans with our financial counselor if needed. Mark stiffened, the word payment snagging on nerves already frayed. Right now? He asked. Yes, Nurse Patel replied gently. We continue emergency care regardless, of course. But for the private room, extended stay, and newborn care after discharge, we need someone documented as financially responsible. Evelyn watched him from the corner of her eye. He pulled his phone out again, thumb tapping the screen a little too hard. A notification from the hospital billing portal glowed up at him. Projected charges, labor, delivery, postnatal care, newborn stay. The number made his mouth flatten. Another contraction caught Evelyn, longer and deeper. She exhaled slowly, letting the nurse coach her through it. Mark didn't move toward her. His eyes were glued to the estimate. The pause that followed wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was calculation. Nurse Patel waited patiently, tablet in hand, used to awkward conversations about money, but rarely with someone dressed this well. Sir? She prompted. Do you want us to pre-authorize now, or would you prefer to speak with our financial counselor first? Evelyn opened her eyes fully and looked at Mark. She didn't speak, didn't plead, didn't remind him that this was their child. She simply watched. Because after years of cushioning him from discomfort, for the first time, she wanted to see what he did when nobody rescued him. Mark glanced at the estimate again, then at the door, then at his phone like it might offer a way out. Lena's words from earlier replayed in his head. Don't let her trap you financially. He inhaled sharply, eyes flicking anywhere but his wife. Give me a minute, he said to the nurse. Nurse Patel nodded, professional and calm. Of course. I'll let the desk know you're reviewing the estimate. She left the room quietly. Evelyn's contraction ended. The monitor beeped in a steady rhythm. Mark slipped his phone back into his pocket and walked toward the hallway, shoulders tight. He told himself he was just getting air. He told himself he'd decide after one more call. Evelyn stared at the closed door. Whatever he chose next, she knew, would be more honest than any love speech he'd ever given her. The hallway hummed with quiet urgency, wheels rolling, doors opening and closing, low voices sliding under the fluorescent lights. Mark leaned against the wall beside a fire extinguisher, as far from the nurse's station as possible while still getting signal. His chest felt tight, not from worry for Evelyn, but from the hospital estimate still glowing in his memory. He pulled out his phone and called Lena back. She picked up on the second ring. Tell me you at least stepped outside, she said, voice smooth, the faint echo of a bar or office behind her. I'm in the hallway, Mark replied, lowering his voice automatically. They just sent me the numbers. He rattled off the figure. Lena whistled softly. That's not small. Yeah, no kidding, he snapped. My cash flow's already stretched. The investor backed out last week, remember? Payroll's due Monday. Lena knew all of this. She handled the marketing for his company, and somewhere along the line, started handling his ego too. She'd listened to every complaint about pressure, expectations, and how Evelyn had decided to stop working. A baby changes everything, Lena said, but her tone wasn't sentimental. Once that kid is here, you're locked into 18 years minimum. School, medical, extra everything. If you sign for everything now, you're telling everyone you'll carry the whole thing forever. She doesn't have income, Mark said, pacing slowly. She left the firm last year. Said she wanted to focus on family. She barely checks emails anymore. He conveniently forgot how many of those family decisions had been driven by his insecurities. Exactly, Lena replied. So why are you the only adult in the room expected to think long-term? He bristled. She's the one having the baby. And you're the one they're asking to sign your name to every bill on that ward, Lena countered. I'm not saying don't take care of your kid. I'm saying don't sign away leverage blindly. Make her show she can contribute. 2. Set conditions. Otherwise, you're nothing but a walking card machine. Mark stared through the narrow window at the lights of the parking lot below. She'll understand, he muttered. She always does. That's because you trained her to, Lena said softly. The words should have bothered him. Instead, they made him feel in control again. He pictured Evelyn at home like he'd always imagined her lately, reading baby blogs, watching daytime TV, between projects, waiting for him to make decisions. He had no picture in his head of her at a conference room table that morning, signing documents that would dwarf every number he'd ever seen. He didn't know that woman existed. Just, don't rush, Lena continued. Tell them you'll arrange something later. Make it clear you're not an open checkbook. If she needs something, she can figure it out too. Mark nodded, even though she couldn't see him. This isn't about you, he said, his conscience pricking just enough to protest. Lena laughed quietly. Of course it's about you. You're the one who has to live with whatever you sign. Call me when you're done playing hero. She hung up before he could answer. Mark stood there for a second, phone still against his ear, even though the line had gone dead. Then he opened the email from the hospital again. Estimated charges. Approve, decline, request counselor. His thumb hovered over approve. He imagined Lena's voice. Don't let her trap you financially. He imagined Evelyn's quiet compliance over the years. Had she ever told him no? Really no? For a brief moment, he pictured going back into the room, taking her hand, saying something like, we'll figure it out. Then he thought about payroll, rent for the office. The failed expansion he hadn't admitted was failing. He convinced himself this was about being responsible. He locked his phone, slipped it into his pocket, and pushed off the wall. As he walked back toward the room, he passed a sign pointing toward billing and patient financial services. He followed it. He had a decision to deliver. The baby cried before anyone spoke. It was a thin, uncertain sound, but it filled the room more completely than any argument could. Evelyn lay propped up in the hospital bed, arms shaky but steady as she held her son against her chest. Warmth, weight, and a smell she knew would be burned into her memory forever. Her hair clung damply to her forehead. Her body ached in deep, unfamiliar ways. But for one suspended moment, everything was just here, alive, enough. The door opened quietly. A woman stepped in, mid-40s, neat bun, badge-reading billing administrator Miss Reynolds. Beside her walked another woman in a cardigan with a clipboard, badge-reading hospital social worker Miss Diaz. Behind them was a younger nurse from the nursery, hands folded, eyes soft. Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Miss Reynolds began. I'm sorry to disturb you. I'll keep this brief. Mark stood at the window, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the parking lot below, like there was something there more interesting than his son's tiny fingers curling and uncurling against Evelyn's gown. What's the problem? He asked without turning. Miss Reynolds cleared her throat. We've received your initial review of the estimate, Mr. Carter. Our records show you declined pre-authorization for postnatal and newborn care. Evelyn's head lifted slightly. Declined? She glanced at Mark. He finally turned, expression tight. I told them I wasn't signing anything until we discussed options. Miss Reynolds kept her tone neutral. To be clear, all emergency and medically necessary care continues regardless. Your son is receiving appropriate care. However, without a documented guarantor, we're required to place an administrative hold on discharge and involve our social work team. The nursery nurse stepped in gently. It just means he'll stay in the nursery until we're sure there's a safe discharge plan and someone legally responsible. It's policy when there's a refusal. The words landed heavier than their calm delivery. Evelyn adjusted her hold on the baby, instinctively drawing him closer. I don't understand. We're here. We're his parents. And we want that documented with a responsible party for the bill, Miss Reynolds said carefully. You have options: insurance, payment plans, financial assistance. But we do need someone to sign. She turned slightly toward Mark, tablet in hand. Mr. Carter, do you want to update your decision? Mark exhaled sharply through his nose. I already told the counselor, he said. We're not authorizing anything new right now. She, he jerked his chin toward Evelyn, has contacts, family, whatever. She can figure it out if she wants extra days in private rooms. The nurse shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn felt something inside her go very, very still. She reached toward the bedside table for her phone with one hand, the baby cradled in the other. The movement was slow, painful. Mark's eyes snapped to the gesture. Don't, he snapped. Don't start calling your old colleagues or your dad's friends begging for loans. It's humiliating. Evelyn paused with the phone in her hand. Humiliating. She unlocked it anyway. Her banking app showed cold numbers, investment accounts, corporate entities, the escrow listing for the deal she'd signed that morning, funds visible but locked by legal agreements until filings cleared, untouchable for now. She had other liquid assets, but any sudden large transfer today would trigger questions from compliance teams she didn't want involved yet. The money wasn't the problem. The truth was, if she bailed Mark out silently again, the pattern would continue. He'd walk out believing there were no consequences to his choices. She closed the app, didn't show him, didn't explain. "Mrs. Carter, Miss," Reynolds said gently. "You're also allowed to sign as guarantor if you prefer, regardless of your employment status." Evelyn met her eyes. "In a few days, I'll settle everything," she said evenly. "Today, I just need to know my son is safe and cared for." "He is," the nursery nurse assured her. "We're not withholding care. This is about documentation." Mark scoffed. "So what? You're holding the baby hostage over paperwork? Over legal responsibility, Miss," Reynolds corrected, still calm. "Sir, we're asking again. Will you authorize payment as the primary guarantor?" Mark's jaw tensed. He glanced at Evelyn, sweaty, exhausted, stitches pulling when she moved. In his mind, she was the one who had stepped back from the world. He was the one out there fighting. "No," he said finally. "Not right now. I said what I said." He looked directly at Miss Reynolds. "Then don't," he added. "Don't add anything else under my name until we've sorted things out. If there isn't a clear way to pay," he added with a shrug, "then don't discharge him yet either. Keep him there until it's sorted." "I'm not signing for any of this." Miss Reynolds' stylist paused for a fraction of a second. Then she tapped, documenting his refusal. "Understood," she said quietly. "I'm required to inform you that this conversation is being documented in your file. Social work and, if necessary, child welfare will be notified to assist with discharge planning." She turned to Evelyn, her professional mask softening. "We'll take your son to the nursery for observation for now. Once the paperwork is settled, he can room in with you again." Evelyn nodded once. Her arms tightened unwillingly as the nurse stepped closer. "I'll bring him back as soon as I can," the nurse whispered. Evelyn nodded again. She didn't trust her voice. The baby left her arms, and the absence was immediate warmth gone, weight gone, a hollow space where he'd been. Mark was already reaching for his phone, conversation over in his mind. Evelyn watched the door as it closed behind the nurse and her child. Her father's voice drifted back to her, calm and merciless. "People tell you who they are when there's something real at stake. Believe them the first time." She laid the phone on her lap, screen up this time. She had every tool she needed. Dates, times, names, witnesses. And for the first time in 7 years, she had no desire to protect Mark from the consequences of his own decisions. He thought this was about money. He thought saying, "Then don't," ended the conversation. He didn't realize he'd just opened a case. The soft click of the door closing sounded louder than it should have. Night had slipped in almost without her noticing. The room was dim now, lit only by the glow of the monitor, tracking her vitals and the small lamp near the sink. The spot on her chest where Noah had slept still felt warm, ghost-heavy. Evelyn stared at the ceiling. She replayed the scene again, but slower this time. "Miss," Reynolds' steady voice. The nurse's apologetic eyes. Mark's shrug. "Then don't." The words no longer sounded like a momentary lapse. They sounded like a verdict. She turned her head toward the door. Through the small pane of glass, she could see a security officer posted at the end of the hall standard protocol whenever social work flagged a file for custody tension or financial dispute. He wasn't there for her. He was there because someone had documented that the baby's father had refused responsibility. Evelyn shifted carefully, biting back a wince as stitches pulled. She reached for her phone on the tray table and unlocked it. Instead of opening her banking app this time, she opened a contact she hadn't used since before she got married. Carter and Doyle Family Law. Saved under a boring label years ago when her father's estate went through probate. She'd kept the number updated out of habit. Not because she thought she'd ever need it like this. She pressed call. The line picked up after one ring. "Carter and Doyle." A calm voice answered. "This is Amanda Carter." "Hi, Amanda. It's Evelyn." Evelyn Carter, formerly Evelyn Rios, from the Rios Energy Estate. The tone on the other end sharpened instantly, shifting from polite to fully present. "Evelyn," Amanda said. "Are you all right?" Evelyn glanced at the empty bassinet. "I just had a baby," she said. "They've taken him to the nursery. My husband refused to sign authorization for the bills." The hospital has documented it and said social work may involve child services if it isn't resolved. Amanda was quiet for half a beat, not shocked, calculating. Do you feel physically safe? She asked. Yes, Evelyn said. But I don't feel protected. Not by him. Understood, Amanda replied. Listen carefully. Right now, do nothing confrontational. Cooperate with hospital staff. Let them document everything. I'll send you a secure link. Forward any emails you've received from the hospital and write down names and times while they're fresh. A notification appeared almost immediately. Evelyn opened the secure portal and started uploading screenshots. The deal we talked about last year? Evelyn added quietly. The acquisition is done. The funds are in escrow. My corporate structure is clean and separate. That gives us options, Amanda said. We'll keep your assets ring-fenced. For now, our priority is your son and your safety. Once you're discharged, we'll file for temporary measures, custody, financial protection, whatever we need. Evelyn swallowed, throat tight but voice steady. There's something else. She turned her head slightly, angling the phone so she could see down the hallway. A few doors away, near the nurse's station, Mark stood in profile, laughing. Beside him, in fitted slacks and a blazer, was Lena. She held a takeaway coffee in one hand, her other hand briefly touching his arm as she smiled up at him. To anyone else, they looked like colleagues or friends. Evelyn knew better. They're here together, she said quietly. He called her. She brought him coffee while our baby is in the nursery and social work is opening a file. Amanda didn't gasp. She didn't curse. She just absorbed. Good, the lawyer said. That means hospital staff have seen them together. Another pattern, another piece of context. What do I do? Evelyn asked. For tonight? Amanda replied. You rest. Answer questions honestly. Don't argue. Don't threaten divorce. Let him think you're too tired to react. I'll start paperwork first thing. We'll request hospital records, social work notes, the billing refusal, and any incident reports. When we move with everything. Evelyn nodded, even though Amanda couldn't see her. And my son? She whispered. The hospital will not withhold medically necessary care, Amanda said firmly. Their file on your husband will do more for you than any speech you could give him tonight. Tomorrow, once I've spoken to their legal department, you'll authorize whatever needs to be authorized yourself. You can afford it. And we will make sure the court sees that you could, even when he pretended you couldn't. Evelyn exhaled slowly, some of the tightness in her chest loosening not because things were okay, but because there was finally a path. They think you're dependent, Amanda added. For the moment, let them keep thinking that. I can do that, Evelyn said. Good, Amanda replied. Then sleep if you can. From this moment on, we document. You don't have to raise your voice. The paperwork will. They ended the call. Outside, Mark said something that made Lena laugh again. A nurse walked past them carrying a chart, glancing at them briefly, taking in more than she'd ever say aloud. Evelyn watched for another second. Then she turned her head away from the window, closed her eyes, and let the monitor's soft beeping lull her into something that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't raw shock anymore either. The moment he refused to pay, he hadn't set a boundary. He'd handed her the clearest evidence she would ever get of who he really was when it cost him something. She didn't need a fight. She had witnesses. She had records. She had patience. Silence, she realized, was not surrender. It was strategy. And by the time Mark understood that, it would be far too late. The first document hit the table with a flat, decisive sound. Evelyn didn't flinch. It had been 5 days since she'd left the hospital with Noah, in a carrier in a thick envelope of discharge papers, and a copy of the hospital's incident summary she'd requested and signed for on the way out. Now she sat in a quiet conference room at Carter & Doyle, the same firm that had handled her father's estate. The city hummed somewhere beyond the tinted windows, but in here, everything was still. Across from her sat Amanda Carter, late 40s, sharp-eyed, composed. Beside Amanda sat a man in his early 50s. Reed, private investigator, former law enforcement. His clothes were simple. His presence wasn't. On the table lay a growing stack of papers and a black tablet. Amanda tapped the top page. Hospital Incident Report, she said, filed by Billing Administrator Reynolds, co-signed by Nurse Patel, and referenced in the social worker's internal note. We also requested their final billing ledger, Amanda went on. It shows the entire balance was paid in full from one of your holding companies 3 days after discharge. That matters. It proves your son was never actually left without care or payment, only that his father refused to be responsible. Evelyn leaned forward just enough to read the bolded line. Spouse refused to authorize payment, direct quote, then don't. Beneath it, date, time, staff present. Her fingers pressed lightly into the table edge. Reed slid another sheet toward her. This is the follow-up from the hospital social work department, he said. They documented that staff expressed concern about your emotional state and your husband's refusal. They flagged it as a risk factor for discharge planning. Amanda's expression stayed neutral. The key point, she added, is that this isn't your word against his. Multiple employees, in writing, all describing the same thing. Evelyn nodded once. Reed reached into his folder again. Next, he said. Server logs. He turned the tablet toward her. Your husband's email shows he opened the hospital estimate and the authorization portal before the refusal. Reed continued. They provided us the access log under your written authorization. They can't share his account content, but they can confirm the timestamps. On the screen. Time, 1743, estimate email opened. Time, 1745, authorization portal open. Time, 1749, authorization declined. Amanda leaned back slightly. So he wasn't confused? He reviewed and then refused. Evelyn's jaw flexed once. He had money, she said quietly. Not a lot, but enough for the initial bills. Reed nodded and slid a thin stack of bank statements forward. We pulled what we legally can at this stage, he said. His business account had enough to cover the hospital's initial requirements. It would have hurt him, but it wouldn't have destroyed him. Evelyn studied the highlighted lines, deposits, withdrawals, balances. So he chose not to use it, she said. Yes, Amanda replied, and that choice matters. Reed tapped another folder. We also have the audio from your husband's call with the hospital's financial counselor, Reed said, tapping the tablet. They record those calls for quality and compliance. With your authorization and our subpoena notice, they release the segment where he confirms he understands the options and still refuses. Now for Lena. Evelyn's eyes lifted. We forensically imaged the shared home computer you authorized us to access, Reed continued. Your husband's messages sync to a desktop app. He never turned off the backup. He spread out printed screenshots, clean, with timestamps. Lena, don't let her trap you financially. Mark, she doesn't even work anymore. Lena, make her show she can contribute. Don't sign everything. Evelyn let the words sit in front of her without reacting. Amanda read them, then exhaled slowly. This shows influence, she said. Not a defense, but context. He was warned about financial traps and chose to interpret his own wife and child as the trap. Reed placed another item on the table, a set of printed photos. Mark entering a hotel 2 nights after Noah's birth. Mark leaving 3 hours later. Lena beside him, her coat open, their body language too familiar to mistake. Taken after he left visiting hours early, Reed said. Timestamps line up with hospital sign-out logs. Evelyn swallowed once. It wasn't the affair that stung. She'd suspected something the first time she heard Lena's name in the delivery room. It was the timing, the sequence. Refuse to sign, leave, go to dinner with someone else. Amanda gathered papers into a neat stack. So, she said, we have written hospital documentation of his refusal, social work notes expressing concern, system logs showing he reviewed and declined, text messages showing premeditated reluctance to support you financially, images that demonstrate where his priorities went immediately afterward. Evelyn looked up. Is it enough? For what we're going to ask the court? Amanda replied. Yes, especially combined with your own financial position. She slid a different folder forward, one stamped with corporate logos and seals. This, Amanda said, is everything you sent from the acquisition this week. Escrow documents, board approvals, valuation summaries, your position as beneficial owner. I've already arranged for the more sensitive parts to be filed under seal. Reed glanced between them. He still doesn't know? He asked. No, Evelyn said. As far as he's concerned, I'm a stay-at-home wife who used to be good with numbers. Amanda's mouth tightened just enough to betray opinion. Good, she said. Let him keep believing that for now. We're going to file for divorce, temporary sole custody, and a restraining order on marital asset transfers. We'll argue that he's a financial risk and a neglectful caregiver. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the stack of evidence. What if he tries to apologize? She asked quietly. What if he suddenly offers to pay for everything and show up? Then, Amanda said, he's admitting he knew what mattered and simply chose not to act until there were consequences. Courts pay more attention to what people do when nobody's watching. Reed stood, collecting some of his notes. He's not going to stop, he said matter-of-factly. Guys like him rarely do. Once he feels cornered, he'll send texts, make calls, maybe even say things that help us. I'll keep monitoring what we can legally monitor. Amanda nodded. You don't confront him. You don't warn him. You don't threaten him with court. You respond through us only. That way, every desperate move he makes goes straight into the file. Evelyn sat back slowly. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel destroyed either. She felt aligned. As if the outside record finally matched the reality she'd been silently living. Amanda closed the main folder and placed it in front of her. When we move, the lawyer said, it will be public. There's no halfway version of this. You understand that, yes? Evelyn held her gaze. I understand. She rose, gathering the folder carefully. Her fingers brushed the hospital report one more time, the line, then don't, still visible through the translucent cover. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware. And somewhere across town, Mark Carter was still switching between texts and meetings. Walking through his days as if nothing had changed, not realizing that every step he took now was being measured against a record that no longer needed his permission to exist. The file was closed. The case, however, was just starting to unfold. 2 weeks later, laughter rose around Mark Carter, just as his world quietly shifted. He stood near the center of a polished event hall, drink in hand, retelling for the third time how he'd navigated a tough quarter and managed cash flow like a pro. The people around him, small investors, other founders, a few local executives nodded, half listening, more interested in being near confidence than verifying competence. Mark thrived in rooms like this. He did not see the woman in the dark blazer until she stopped directly in front of him. Mark Carter? She asked. Her voice was clear, professional, practiced. She carried a slim leather folder. Her expression was neutral, not hostile. Mark turned, still smiling. Yeah, that's me. He expected a business card, a compliment, a request to connect. Instead, she opened the folder. My name is Angela Perez, she said. I'm a process server. You are being served with a divorce petition and accompanying motions for temporary custody and financial orders. The words sliced through the noise. The closest circle fell silent first. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Someone's glass clinked softly against the table, suddenly too loud. Mark blinked once, then laughed, the sound sharp and off-key. This is someone's mixed something up, he said. You've got the wrong guy. Angela didn't argue. She held out the folder. You've been properly identified. Service is complete. His fingers closed around the documents automatically. Nearby, one of the event organizers signaled discreetly to venue security. 2 guards shifted position, not closing in, just watching. Not for violence, for embarrassment. Mark's neck felt hot. What is this? He muttered, flipping through the first pages too fast to understand. Legal phrases flashed past his eyes. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Motion for temporary sole, legal and physical custody. Request for temporary orders restraining dissipation of marital assets. And that phrase, based in part on documented medical abandonment and financial neglect. His chest tightened. Behind him, someone whispered, Is that Evelyn? Another voice. Did he get served at an event? Mark snapped the folder shut. Across the room, at the edge of the bar area, Lena stood frozen mid-sip. Her eyes met his for a split second wide, assessing, and then, almost imperceptibly, she stepped back. Distance. Did you know about this? He demanded, taking an involuntary step toward her. Lena's lips parted, but no answer came. Instead, her gaze flicked sideways, scanning who was watching, where the nearest exit was, which conversations had already changed tone. The process server glanced at her watch. All future communication can go through your attorney, she said, tone still polite. Then she turned and left. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket. A new email from his office bank, an automatic alert. Notice, legal documents received referencing account. He ignored it. He shoved his way to the edge of the group and out a side door onto a small balcony, air cooler but not calming. He opened the folder again, more carefully this time. Attached to the petition was a thick exhibit stack. On top, hospital incident report, Carter, Evelyn. Next, social work note, financial refusal. Then, screenshots he recognized with a jolt. His words to Lena about not wanting to be a wallet. Lena's messages about not letting Evelyn trap him financially. His mouth went dry. He fumbled for his phone and dialed Evelyn. The call rang once, twice, straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again. Same result. A memory flickered. Evelyn in the hospital bed, her face pale, eyes steady, saying nothing while he argued with Miss Reynolds. He remembered feeling oddly triumphant when she didn't fight back. It hit differently now. Mark turned back toward the event hall, looking for Lena. Through the glass, he saw her already talking to someone else, her body angled away from him, not even glancing in his direction. The guards at the door looked politely bored and quietly alert. He checked the papers again, hunting for some line that would say this is reversible, this is a warning, not a reality. Instead, he found a bold sentence near the end. Hearing on temporary orders scheduled for date. Respondent is required to appear. Failure to do so may result in default. His heart pounded. He had come here to talk about timing and smart risks. Now, for the first time, he realized he had no idea how much time he had left before this folder turned into something he couldn't charm his way around. He stared at his reflection in the glass suit, perfect, drink still in his hand, smile gone. If this was just the petition, what else did she have that he hadn't seen yet? Several weeks after he was served, court is now in session. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom, followed by the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of people settling into place. Mark Carter sat at the respondent's table, suit pressed so sharply it looked like armor. The illusion broke at his hands. They were clasped too tightly on the table, knuckles white. His attorney, a man he'd hired in a rush after being served, whispered something in his ear that didn't seem to land. Across the aisle, Evelyn sat beside Amanda Carter. She wore a simple dress, no jewelry aside from her wedding ring still on. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. There were faint shadows under her eyes, the kind all new parents carried, but there was nothing broken in her face. At the back, a carrier rested beside a trusted family friend, rocking gently with the smallest of motions. Baby Noah slept, oblivious. On the bench sat Judge Holloway, early 60s, silver hair, eyes that had seen too many people treat court like theater. He scanned the case file in front of him, then looked up. Case number 3475, Carter versus Carter, he said. We're here today on petitioner's motions for temporary orders concerning custody, support, and financial restraints. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? Amanda rose. Yes, Your Honor. Mark's attorney stood as well. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Holloway nodded. Miss Carter, you may begin. Amanda walked to the center of the courtroom, a small remote in her hand. Behind her, a screen flickered to life. This case, she said, is not at its core about wealth. It is about responsibility under pressure. She clicked the remote. A hospital logo appeared, followed by a scanned page. Exhibit A, Amanda said. Hospital incident report dated the day of the child's birth. I direct the court's attention to the section highlighted in yellow. The text zoomed in. Spouse refused to authorize payment despite explanation of options. Verbatim quote documented by 2 staff. Then don't. Administrative hold initiated. Social work notified. A murmur rippled through the gallery seats. Amanda continued. Exhibit B, internal social work note. It notes concern that the father refused to sign as guarantor while the mother was recovering from childbirth and that he left the hospital shortly after without resolving the matter. Next slide. Authorized access log entries from the hospital billing portal. Timestamp showing viewing of estimate, then a declined authorization. Exhibit C, Amanda said. System log confirming the respondent opened and declined the financial authorization. She paused, letting the judge process the sequence. We also submit bank statements indicating that, at the time of refusal, the respondent had sufficient funds to secure initial payment, even if doing so would have been inconvenient. Mark's attorney stood. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is speculating about my client's obligations regarding inconvenient payments. Overruled, Judge Holloway said calmly. This is a temporary orders hearing, not a criminal trial. I'm assessing patterns and risks. Continue, Miss Carter. Amanda nodded, unbothered. Exhibit D, she said, clicking again. Screenshots appeared, text exchanges between Mark and Lena. Names and phone numbers redacted for public display but present in the sealed file. Don't let her trap you financially. She doesn't even work anymore. Make her show she can contribute. Don't sign everything. These messages were retrieved from a device sync that both parties had access to, Amanda said. They show that the respondent's refusal to authorize care was not a momentary oversight. It reflects a pre-existing belief that supporting his wife and newborn child financially was a trap to avoid. Mark stared at the floor. And finally, Exhibit E. Another click. Photos appeared. Mark and Lena entering and leaving a hotel 2 nights after the birth. The timestamps matched against hospital records showing early sign-out from visiting hours. Not illegal, Amanda said, without judgment. But it is context. While the hospital was flagging his refusal in their system, and while social work was attempting to ensure safe discharge conditions for a newborn, the respondent's priority was elsewhere. The room was very still now. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Amanda set the remote down. There is one more piece of information relevant to these proceedings, she said. The respondent has claimed both in correspondence and through counsel that the petitioner is financially dependent on him. That is not accurate. She approached the bench with a sealed folder, handing it to the clerk, who passed it up. Under seal, Your Honor, Amanda said. Corporate documents, escrow statements, and valuation analyses. They relate to a recent acquisition completed by the petitioner in her professional capacity. Judge Holloway opened the folder, eyes moving quickly over the pages. Corporate seals, escrow confirmations, signatures. He looked up, eyebrows raised slightly. This indicates a transaction valued at approximately $1 billion. Yes, Your Honor, Amanda replied. The deal is currently under confidentiality restrictions with regulators, which is why we've requested sealed treatment. The key point for today is this. At the time of the birth, the petitioner's financial position was significantly stronger than the respondent believed. She had the means and structure to eventually resolve medical bills herself. She let that sink in. The problem, she continued, is not that they were poor. The problem is that, when faced with his wife in recovery and a newborn child, the respondent's first instinct was to protect his own sense of control, even if it meant leaving his child's discharge in limbo. She returned to her table and sat. Judge Holloway folded his hands, turning his attention to Evelyn. Mrs. Carter, he said, voice steady. Is it true that you are the beneficial owner of the entities described in these documents? Yes, Your Honor, Evelyn replied, standing. The funds are in escrow. I did not move them at the time because of regulatory rules and because I wanted accurate documentation of my husband's choices without my interference. Mark's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client had no knowledge of this transaction. He believed his wife had no income. His decisions were based on incomplete information she chose not to share. Judge Holloway shifted his gaze to Mark. Mr. Carter, he said, did hospital staff explain that options existed: insurance, payment plans, financial assistance? Mark cleared his throat. They mentioned some things, yes. Did you understand that your refusal would delay discharge and trigger involvement from social services? I didn't think it would go that far, Mark said. Judge Holloway's expression didn't change. The law does not require your wife to disclose every asset she holds in order for you to act in good faith toward your own child, the judge said. You weren't asked to sign over your business. You were asked to accept financial responsibility as a parent. Silence. I will take a brief recess before issuing temporary orders, Judge Holloway said finally. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. The gavel fell. Conversations erupted in low whispers. The bailiff called for order, even as people leaned toward each other, already spreading the version of the story they would retell later. Mark turned in his seat toward Evelyn. Evelyn, please, he whispered harshly. We can talk. This is getting out of hand. She did not look at him. Amanda leaned in, murmured something to her client. Evelyn nodded once, eyes forward. Mark's attorney tugged his sleeve. We need to discuss damage control, he said under his breath. But Mark barely heard him over the roar of the only question he could form. If this was just the temporary hearing, what did the final version of his life look like from here? Mr. Carter, please stand. The courtroom settled into a heavy silence as Mark rose. His knees felt unsteady, not from the polished floor beneath him, but from the feeling that something much larger was about to shift. Judge Holloway's voice was calm, the calm of someone who had made his decision already. Having reviewed the exhibits, heard sworn testimony, and considered the arguments of counsel, the judge began. The court finds substantial evidence of the respondent's neglectful conduct at a critical moment in his child's life. Mark stared straight ahead, throat dry. The record shows, Judge Holloway continued, that Mr. Carter had the capacity to assist with hospital bills and discharge planning, but chose not to. It further shows that he viewed his wife's and child's needs through the lens of financial leverage rather than parental responsibility. He turned a page in his notes. Accordingly, as to temporary orders pending final dissolution, the court rules as follows. First, temporary sole legal and physical custody of the minor child is awarded to the petitioner, Evelyn Carter. The respondent shall have supervised visitation at a frequency to be scheduled through the court's Family Services Department once a formal parenting plan is established. Mark's hands tightened on the back of his chair. Second, the respondent is ordered to pay temporary child support and contribute to medical expenses in an amount calculated pursuant to the statutory guidelines. A specific figure will be entered into the written order. A rustle moved through the gallery. Third, the court grants the petitioner's request for a temporary restraining order, preventing both parties, especially the respondent, from transferring, hiding, or dissipating marital assets outside the ordinary course of living and business expenses. Any unusual transfers from this point forward must be reported to the court. Mark felt his stomach drop. Fourth, in light of the evidence presented regarding hospital incident reports and the respondent's documented refusal, this court is referring the record to the appropriate prosecutorial authorities for review of potential charges related to medical neglect and financial misconduct. The court does not determine criminal liability. It does, however, have an obligation to refer concerning conduct when it intersects with the welfare of a child. The words hung in the air like a weight. Mark's knees buckled slightly. He sat down heavily, the chair scraping across the floor. Beside him, his attorney muttered, "We'll appeal the scope of the custody order," but the words sounded thin, like promises made inside a burning house. Across the aisle, Evelyn quietly gathered her papers. Judge Holloway continued, voice steady. Finally, the parties' marriage is hereby dissolved on an interlocutory basis. Property division and permanent orders will be finalized in subsequent proceedings, but the marital status is terminated effective today. A clerk's pen scratched the official record. Mark looked over at Evelyn for the first time since the ruling began. She stood now, folder in hand, head slightly bowed as Amanda said something in a low tone. Her face wasn't triumphant. It wasn't vindictive. It was finished. Mrs. Carter, Judge Holloway added, the court notes your restraint in these proceedings and your preparedness despite difficult circumstances. The court also notes that you had the capacity to pay for your child's care and ultimately did so after discharge, but that you did not interfere with how the hospital documented the respondent's refusal. That decision provided clarity to this court. Evelyn nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Holloway looked between them one last time. This matter will return to my docket for final orders, he said. Until then, these temporary orders have the full force of law. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. The bailiff called, "All rise," as the judge left the bench. People stood, then immediately began to turn, whisper, move. Mark didn't move. Evelyn, he croaked suddenly, the word tearing its way out of his throat. Please. She paused at the aisle, folder in one hand, her other resting lightly on the handle of Noah's carrier as their family friend prepared to stand. We can fix this, Mark said, voice shaking. I'll pay everything, the hospital, support, whatever you want. Just don't do this to me. Several people in the gallery shifted, eyes darting between them and the bailiff. Evelyn didn't answer. You didn't tell me about the deal, he said, louder now, desperation bleeding through. You never told me you had money like that. How was I supposed to know? Amanda laid a hand gently on Evelyn's arm, a silent reminder that she didn't owe him anything. Not explanations, not comfort, not a performance. Evelyn turned just enough for Mark to see her profile. He waited for anger, an accusation, some explosive line he could argue against in his head later. Instead, she gave him nothing. No words, no reaction. She adjusted her grip on the carrier handle and walked toward the doors. "Miss Us. Carter, this way, please," a court officer said quietly, holding one door open for her and her small entourage. Mark lurched forward as if to follow, but a bailiff stepped slightly into his path. "Sir," the bailiff said, calm but firm, "you'll need to remain here until the hallway is clear." Mark stopped. He watched as the doors closed behind Evelyn, the small outline of Noah's carrier disappearing into the bright light of the corridor. The echo of the closing door was final in a way the gavel hadn't been. His attorney muttered something about filing motions, requesting modifications. Mark barely heard him. He had believed right up until this moment that there would be one last conversation that would undo everything. One apology, one dramatic plea, one chance. Instead, all he got was silence and the sight of her walking away without looking back. He finally understood. She hadn't come here to argue. She'd come to confirm, on paper, what had already happened the moment he said 2 words in a hospital room. The courthouse doors opened, not with a dramatic crash, just a firm, decisive push. Sunlight spilled across the stone steps outside as Evelyn stepped out, Noah's carrier handle wrapped firmly in her hand. The baby stirred once and then settled, the car seat canopy shading his face. A few reporters waited at the bottom of the steps, alerted by whispers about the billion-dollar wife and the hospital case. Their cameras weren't news truck large, but their eyes were sharp. "Mrs. Carter, was the ruling what you hoped for? Is it true you signed a billion-dollar deal? Do you think the system protected you today?" Evelyn didn't speed up. She didn't slow down. Her heels clicked in an even rhythm against the stone. "Miss..." Carter walked one step behind and to the side, a quiet buffer against the questions. "It's done," Amanda said softly when they reached the bottom. Evelyn looked down at Noah. His tiny chest rose and fell in the same steady rhythm the monitor had tracked days ago. Only now, there was no machine, no fluorescent light, no administrative hold. "Yes," she said, "it is." She didn't look back at the courthouse. Inside, in the cooled quiet of the now empty courtroom, Mark remained sitting for a long time, long after the clerk had gathered papers and the bailiff had relaxed at his post. The hum of the vents and the occasional creak of wood were the only sounds. His attorney eventually touched his arm. "We'll go over your options," the man said. "Appeals, modifications, compliance steps so the criminal referral doesn't become something worse." Mark barely nodded. He stared at the spot where Evelyn's chair had been, then at the door she'd walked through. The room felt larger now, but not in a good way. Like a theater after the lights came up and the audience had left. He had always thought power meant being the one everyone turned to, being the center of attention, being the provider. Now, with his name on a stack of court orders and referrals, with his access to his son reduced to supervised visits, and with the knowledge that his ex-wife had quietly built a financial life he couldn't touch, the word meant something else entirely. Power, he realized, was the ability to walk away and never need to come back to this room again. Outside, a breeze lifted a strand of hair near Evelyn's face. She tucked it back with one hand, the other still resting on the carrier handle. She paused by her car and opened the back door, clicking Noah's seat into its base with practiced care. He scrunched his face, then relaxed again as she adjusted his blanket. She leaned her forehead gently against the edge of the seat, her voice only a whisper. "I didn't destroy him," she said quietly, more to herself than to the baby. "I just stopped protecting him." She straightened, closed the door with a soft click, and walked around to the driver's side. Behind her, the courthouse loomed solid, unmovable, already receding into the background of her life. The real power she knew now wasn't in the building itself. It was in the record, the incident reports, the timestamps, the texts, the orders signed by a judge confirming what she'd lived through. It was in her choice to stop cushioning someone else's consequences. Inside, the last court employee turned off the overhead lights. The room dimmed. The polished wood gleamed dully, empty. Mark stood at the back now, near the doors, one hand resting against the frame. Beyond them lay a life with restrictions, supervision, and a reputation that would now always come with a silent asterisk. He thought of the hospital estimate he'd stared at, the moment he'd said, "Then don't." The feeling of control he'd had. For the first time, he understood the scale of that choice. He hadn't just refused to pay a hospital bill. He'd signaled who he really was when something real was on the line. And in doing so, he didn't just lose money. He lost access to a woman who had quietly become worth more than he'd ever imagined on paper and off. Outside, Evelyn started the engine. No music, no victory speech. Just the low hum of a car pulling away from a building she no longer needed. As she drove down the street, the courthouse shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by open road and the small, steady sound of her son's breathing. He had refused to pay a hospital bill, and that decision cost him a marriage, a child, and a life measured in billions. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.